Anytime.
Hello, my name is Robert Coutts, and I am the chief editor of the journal Prairie History. Uh, we are marking the release of our third issue of the journal, interviewing some of the authors from the new issue about their articles. Today, I'm joined by Linda Dietrick, who has written the article, quote, World Famous Plants from Manitoba and the breeders behind them. Linda is the editor of the journal Prairie Garden, Western Canada's only gardening annual, which has been published since 1937. Linda is a retired professor of German and is a senior scholar at the University of Winnipeg. Her research uh, focuses on the relationship of the Romantic writers with plants. So I was very intrigued with that, as was Gord. Um, that I probably shouldn't interrupt your talk about what you've written, but I'm um, wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about the relationship between Romantic writers and plants in your research, if you could use that as an
Certainly,
introduction.
certainly. Um, well, if you talk about your popular associations with Romanticism, right? Plenty of nature poetry, lots of flowers, right? Lots of plants and flowers, and the connection between poetry or writing in general and nature is sort of central to both English and German Romanticism. I think most people would agree with you on that. There's an organicism, as they say, although organicism is a difficult term in the 21st century, but nevertheless. And now, what interests me is actually the text that the writers of the time knew about botany, about plants, and specifically about plant reproduction and how plants make more plants, or if you like, the natural history of plants, the way plants and humans, well, of course, this always plays a role, the way plants and humans are alike in the sense that they are both embedded in, plugged into nature and continually renew themselves, continually grow and change and make more things. So one of the intriguing things that I found is that women writers, also some male Romantic writers, will equate themselves with plants, and specifically with the creativity of plants, with the growth, the changing, the metamorphosis, the ever new creativity of plants. And in fact, around the time that I'm studying, 1800, people were well aware that plants have sexuality, that plants reproduce using male parts and female parts. Well, what does it mean if a female writer starts talking about a flower? Well, she's not just sort of hiding behind the standard trope of women as beautiful roses and flowers and so on. She may also be alluding to the fact that she is a creative poet, just like plants are creative things. And it's not just a metaphor. I mean, Romantics really do believe that human beings and plants and animals and trees and all of that are all on the same continuum, are all part of the same ever-changing, ever-growing creation. So it's kind of like a part for the whole. The plant stands for all of us and all of us. And that's something that still speaks to us today because, nature is not something that's just out there. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having all the problems we're having with what we've done to the environment. It's affecting us inside us and outside of us, isn't it? Nature is something that we're part of in the same way that a plant, you look down and it can't even move. It is plugged into, it is embedded in, it is part of nature. And in a way, it stands for us being part of nature, doesn't it? As the indigenous people say, we are the relatives of plants, but we're the little brothers and sisters. They were here way before we were. Anyway, all of that sort of plays a role, I think, in Romantic writing already around 1800.
Interesting. Well, that's really good. That sort of ties it together when I was asking about the Romantic writers and plants. As I mentioned, you talked about the journal that you now editing that's been going since 1937, and that's continuously since 1937. Is that correct?
Almost entirely continuously. There were 3 years during World War II when it was not published. But this, if you do the math from 37, this is our, if you minus the 3 years during the war, There it is. That's the newest edition.
Oh,
There are 82. This is the 82nd edition since
yeah.
1937.
Wow. Well, congratulations. That's terrific. So you've been the editor now for a while.
For 3 years, and I'm about to be the retired editor. I'm about to be replaced.
Are there set terms for editor, or are they?
Not really, not really. Some editors have been there, stayed there for, well, close to 20 years, and others for 10 years, and others for 1 year. So
Yeah,
it varies.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess the question is, how did you become interested in all this, and in horticulture, but in the journal itself?
Well, I've been a gardener for, I guess, well over 30 years now. So gardening has been part of my life, part of my hobby life, my part-time, my free time for a long time. But when I retired, and I retired in 2016 from the University of Winnipeg, I decided that I would start pursuing horticulture a little more seriously. So I got my Master Gardener certification, which you have to take some courses to do and do volunteer work and pass a test and all of that. So I did that when I was retiring. And then I thought, well, as an academic, I have experience in, I taught German as a language, and I've marked an awful lot of essays in English and in German. I thought to myself, well, writing is, I've written essays, I've been edited, I've edited essays. This is the sort of area where I could apply both my professional skills and my interest in gardening. So I volunteered to be a member of the Prairie Garden Committee. And as often happens with people, within a year or so, I was enlisted to chair the committee, and then within another year, I was enlisted to become or volunteered to become the editor of the journal completely. And it's been really fun. It's been really fun. I've been able to use all of my skill sets, including my horticultural skill sets, on the editing of the journal. We have, every issue has somewhere between 50 and 60 essays in it, or
Really?
sometimes short little articles. Oh yeah, and photographs and illustrations. It only comes out once a year, so you kind of have to pace yourself. You guys probably are in three times a year. You're in a panic mode, whereas I only have that about once a year when everything comes together.
Yes,
but I enjoy, the contact with the authors and soliciting articles and, working with authors to smooth them out and do all of those things that you do as an editor.
Yeah. Yes, I know that well. Well, that's really interesting. I mean, to be editor of a journal that has run pretty much continuously since 1937 would make it one of the oldest long-running journals in Canada, I would think.
Indeed.
Yeah.
I became interested in the history of horticulture in Manitoba because I took on a couple of projects as editor, and one of them was to create an index, a subject index, to all of the articles published since 1937, something like 2,000 articles. And so I, figured out how to do it with spreadsheets. Somebody had gotten started on it, but there had been 5-year indexes over the years, but they were all with sort of different subject categories. There was a lot of, reconciling and harmonizing that had to happen. And I basically took all of those article titles and authors and issues and the page numbers they were on and organized them into a big long spreadsheet. And in the course of doing that, I became really, really familiar with the old issues going back to 1937. The 40s, the 50s, are full of really, really interesting articles, not just from the standpoint of information about how to garden. I mean, some of those articles you don't want to apply, you don't want to use them anymore because they recommend DDT or whatever, right? That there are some things that have gone out of date. But it's really, if you look at the old articles, and that index is now on the Prairie Garden's website, which is the Prairie theprairiegarden.com, the Prairie Garden, all one word.com. You'll find my index there, and you will see that anybody who's been anybody in horticulture in Manitoba since the 30s is represented in the book. We have, frankly, Skinner wrote quite a few articles, at least 20. People involved with the Morden experimental farm, the Dominion experimental farm at Morden, which then became the Morden Research Station, Morden Research Center then. Morden Research Station is what I usually call it. All of the people involved with Morden were writers for the Prairie Garden, anybody involved in horticulture at the U of M, all kinds of amateur horticulturalists, people specialized in all kinds of different plants. They all had occasion to write for the Prairie Garden. And so, in my opinion, it is the most important historical resource for horticulture in this province. There's just no question. Yeah. Anybody who was anybody wrote for the Prairie Garden. And I should add that it was all volunteer. It was originally the annual report of the Winnipeg Horticultural Society, which no longer exists, but it did until I think about 2000. And from there, it grew. It became a source of information for people in our whole region. Lots of people in Saskatchewan subscribed in the past, over to Alberta, Northwest Ontario, and then south in the Dakotas, and Minnesota and so on. We have friends who get the book down there as well and contribute to the book. And I think the reason why it became so popular, at its peak, it was publishing 15,000 copies a year. And by volunteers. I don't know how they even did the distribution. It's ridiculous. But the publication became extremely popular because there was just nothing. There was just nothing for people who were gardening in this zone 3, a very short season, very, very extreme climate zone that we have here on the prairies, on the northern prairies and northern Great Plains. And I think they were just desperate for reliable information that they could use to grow their vegetable gardens, to grow their ornamental gardens. And they found it.
I was just getting a very general question, historical question here, and I don't know if you have an opinion on this, but just the kind of horticultural movement that you talked about, with going back to people like Skinner and I'm forgetting the other person that you talk about.
Well, everybody involved with the Morden Research Station. So William Cumming, Marshall, Henry Marshall, the great Henry Marshall, and so on and so forth. Yeah. Yeah,
right. Do you think that was all part of the, I think it was the City Beautiful movement in this province, in the city in particular, in the early early 20th century, tree planting, horticulture, and all that? Do you think it was all part of that sort of greening? I don't know if you want to call it greening of Winnipeg, kind of.
Sure, I'm sure they were related. I think those movements were. I think it gave impetus to the publication, and the publication gave impetus to those who were pursuing that ideal of the City Beautiful. But I mean, the people who wrote for the Prairie Garden and the people who read the Prairie Garden had all kinds of other ideals and goals in mind, including vegetable gardens. I mean, the home vegetable garden was extremely important, and only sort of fell out of favor for a while. It's back in again, as you may realize. The garden centers can't keep vegetables in stock anymore. There was a great deal of stuff on landscaping urban lots, but a lot of people in Manitoba still lived on farms in those days. So there was lots of articles about how to plant a larger acreage, or shelter belt trees, or focuses on small towns, for example, and what you could do there. But for sure, the City Beautiful movement led to many people joining gardening clubs and societies, and having competitions to have the best yard in the city, and all of those kinds of things. It was called Home Grounds. The Home Grounds competition was very big. The railroads had their railroad gardens, and that was also part of. I think the federal government and the provincial governments were right behind all of this, because it made this a more desirable place for people to move to and to live in. And very, very important for economic activity in our region, if people thought they were moving to a place that was beautiful. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Linda, for the article. I think it's a wonderful piece. It's a bit different, I have to say, and in a good way from some of the things we published in the past. But and some beautiful illustrations that went with it. and gave me some ideas about what I might be planting in my back patio. Because I am terrible at planting things that die almost immediately. So I might take your advice on things. And someday in a COVID walk, we might, being close by, we might interact. And
Absolutely.
you can
Anytime.
show
I
me,
love doing that. I'd love to do
yeah,
that.
you can
Yeah.
show me your garden, and then I think late July is the, or maybe early August is the height of our garden,
Yeah.
where it tends to be a little overgrown, but you might give me some advice on, don't plant this, but plant that, and that sort of thing.
Sure. Sure.
Anyway, thank you, Linda, for your contribution to the journal. We really appreciate it, and thank you for joining us today. It's terrific.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it too.